It's the Brad and John Show.
May 20th is the date, 2025. This is the C block, the Charlie block, which means we started around 7:40 or so. And as John calls this, the crazy weird block that Brad sort of dominates, right? With all my crazy weird stories.
CWS block. Yeah, crazy weird story.
Crazy weird stories. Okay. You know, I think one day people will look back at the past 4 years. The past 4 years, actually now you consider 5 years, when we had Trump go against Biden in the 2020 election. Biden wins, even though people have hesitations about Joe Biden. And now you look back over those last 4 years, and it becomes increasingly clear that there was a massive cover-up, a massive problem with the fact that the president which we had, whom we had, was, shall we say, not really in control. And
incapacitated.
Your buddy, Mr. Phyllis Schlafly, protege, who was supposed to be, what department was he supposed to be in? And he got shot down for that. He was supposed to be, what is he, in DOJ?
U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C.
Right, that's right, U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. And instead, now he's some other thing in DOJ where he's going after various things. Have you heard the latest in what he's essentially been charged to take care of?
No, what's that?
Well, he's now delving into the autopin situation. And he's delving into the situation that, did the president really pardon these people? Or did somebody in the White House say, hey, we turn on that autopin. My buddy Jim Smith's been in jail for 10 years now, and he's a good guy. Turn on the autopin and sign this document I just ran off the printer. Get what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, yeah.
That Mr. Biden was not really in control. Okay. On Sunday, I listened to, and once again, I don't know why I torture myself, but I listened to National Public Radio. And what was sort of interesting was, you know, I've talked about the fact, and I don't want to sound like I'm super critical of KWMU because I do listen to it. It's frustrating.
Right. We get it enough with the preface.
It's frustrating to me. They have this huge staff, but yet they produce hardly any newscasts on the radio, and they have nothing on the weekend. They do zero newscast on the weekend. I believe it was Jason Rosenbaum who was running a promo on Sunday morning saying, oh, St. Louis Public Radio, we're out there in the streets looking at all the tornado damage and blah, 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 blah. And we're doing the reports, and our whole staff is out there, and we're helping pick up trees, and we're the yard signs we gave away yesterday, we're picking up and putting back on people's yards. We're taking care of business. And I never heard another thing the entire day, okay? But I do listen throughout the day. And they have this one program called the New Yorker Hour. Are you familiar with the New Yorker?
No. I know the publication. I didn't know that they had.
Yes.
They seem like the kind of publication that would have something on National Public Radio. Sure.
Right. And I think if you had to typify New Yorker's leanings, what would you say, John?
I'd say far left, snarky cartoons and just really elitist stuff.
Right.
Kind of people that eat bagels and lox and look down their nose at Americans.
They had Jake Tapper on, and you're the man with all the names. The guy that's gotten little publicity, but they wrote this book together. Isn't he an Axios guy? Who's the co-author of the
I'm not sure who wrote that book with Tapper, but I can look that up while you talk.
Yeah, go ahead and the guy who hosts the New Yorker Radio Hour was, and I have to admit to you, doing a good job at grilling them, and essentially and repeatedly saying, okay, if you have all this, and what's interesting about it is they bragged about the fact that they wanted to make sure, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I don't know if this is like particularly kosher in that respect, but they bragged about the fact that they didn't want to be accused of having any wrong facts in their book. They hired the fact checker from the New Yorker. Jake Tapper, what's the guy's name? You got it already, don't you?
Alex Thompson.
Alex Thompson. He's a writer for Axios, isn't he?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay. The interesting thing was he was more forthcoming during the presidential time of Biden, essentially saying this guy has lost it. And what's interesting about this is that Jake Tapper was not. And what's fascinating to me is the New Yorker guy was asking them repeatedly about, well, why wasn't this known? Why didn't anybody talk about this? Why didn't the press cover this? And he never really got an answer, which I thought was interesting. He was asking the question. It's sort of like Kara Spencer yesterday when she's in front of the St. Louis media, and repeatedly the St. Louis media said, whose job was it to press the button for the tornado warning on Friday? And she would never answer that. I mean,
I get what you're saying, yeah.
Okay, so yesterday, this is sort of interesting. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal comes out with an article, which is sort of interesting. Let me break this as Wall Street Journal calls out Tapper for sneering at paper's story about Biden's decline. The Wall Street Journal, get this, Wall Street Journal editorial board called out Jake Tapper on Sunday for previously dismissing the paper's June 2024 article, so that would have been almost a year ago, about former President Joe Biden showing signs of slipping. The criticism comes as Tapper's new book on Biden's decline while in office is set to be released. Quote, the Wall Street Journal reported in a detailed piece on June 4th, 2024, last year, matter of fact, that would be, in 2 weeks, it'll be June 4th, 2025, so almost a year ago, that those who observed Mr. Biden in person were concerned about his decline. Mr. Tapper quoted a White House dismissal of the story, including a sneer that the Journal is owned by News Corp, which is run by the Murdochs. That was a quote from Jake Tapper, as if that rebutted the story. He then interviewed a Democrat who dismissed the paper's editorial board wrote, recalling a segment from Tapper's CNN show, The Lead. This is what the board said. A more curious journalist would have explored if it were true, and maybe even done some of his own reporting. Only now does he tacitly admit the Journal was right. And the Journal reported at the time that the president was showing signs of slipping as reporters spoke to 45 lawmakers, administration officials about Biden's mental faculties. Remember this story? This was a big story a year ago.
I do, yeah.
When the Wall Street Journal went in and they talked about, I don't know about 45, they talked about 45 lawmakers. Tapper, it is Axios reporter, Alex Thompson's new book, Original Sin, President Biden Decline, His Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again, will be released on Tuesday. I have a serious problem with this Jake Tapper dude. I mean, why wasn't he standing on the desk at CNN going, hey, I mean, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this president has serious mental illness. He has serious mental decline. I don't know what it is. I don't know what disease it is, but he can't remember. And now it comes out that George Clooney was upset. George Clooney was upset because of the fact he met personally. And by the way, have you heard the story on that? That when Clooney met
you mentioned
Biden?
This about a week ago, Brad, and I mentioned that Mark Cox talked about it on his show too. That Clooney was upset because Biden had no idea who he was.
I mean, now think about that for a minute, okay? Sometimes you have somebody you haven't seen for a while. Let's say like, a friend of your past you haven't seen. Some of you work with at Monsanto who you haven't seen.
Yeah, you might not remember their name exactly, but
right.
If they were a famous movie star, I'd probably recognize their face.
That's
and
my
Brad, your
point.
Question, let's get back to your original question, was why didn't you ask rhetorically, why didn't Jake Tapper stand on the desk at CNN and say something? The obvious answer seems to be because he wanted to make sure that Donald Trump didn't win. So he would want to make sure that he didn't do anything that would possibly help the Trump campaign. But I guess I'm curious because I haven't listened to a Tapper interview. What's his answer to that? Surely he's been asked about that.
He dances around it. I've heard a couple interviews with him. He just dances around it, to the point where, we knew these things, but, I heard him say they couldn't verify sources. Now, come on.
I mean, you have two eyes and ears. Like, you could give your opinion. And I think I did see the tweet from a Wall Street Journal account in which they pointed out how vociferously mainstream media defended Biden's mental acuity. In other words, the Republicans who were saying this are just being crazy and or they're being ageist against Biden. Right.
It would be like, let's take a different topic and go back 4 years ago. If John would put on his Twitter account, I don't think that COVID vaccine is going to work, and I don't think it's going to prevent me from getting COVID. Matter of fact, I don't think if I have COVID, I don't think it's going to stop the spread of COVID. John, your tweet would have been vapor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Twitter would have labeled it misinformation, and I would have gotten a stern warning.
Right. Okay. Sometimes, as a student of journalism, you study foreign governments and how they control the press. Okay, and yet we say, "Oh, we're America. We got freedom of the press." We really don't. There are people that will essentially tout freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And I'll give a perfect example. Tracy Ellis. That's how she founded a radio station. She was upset with the fact that 97.1 was not being hardcore right-wing enough for her, so she started her own radio station, okay? But yet, I can listen to Tracy's station and say, I wonder why they didn't talk about this or this or this, because they don't want anybody to talk about certain topics on their radio station. Get what I'm saying, John?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, sure.
Okay, so everybody has their bias. And that's why I say, here's my phone number, 314-280-8880. You don't agree with what we're talking about? You want to come on the air and dispute anything I say? Be more than happy to. And the crazy thing about it is, guess what? Nobody will call me. And what's interesting about that is, especially if you are a right-wing type of publication, and if you're a right-wing radio station, the reason no one will from the left will come on is because they don't want to be in a position where they could made look stupid or have their points refuted. But the interesting part of that is, if I were a Democratic guy, I would want to be all over Fox News. I would say, hey, anytime you want me to come, I've got my own little studio at home, got my own camera, we got high def, audio, we got high def camera, the whole bit, and a lot of these people are doing their interviews from their home now. I mean, hey, anytime you want, I'll be more than happy to come on Fox. See, don't you think that that's the smart move to make, rather than to say that Fox doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of liberals who take that tack, and I think Fox News has been, it's well documented. Fox News has, from the beginning, wanted to have liberals come on to at least show a semblance of two sides of a lot of stories. And more locally, you would see that with the Reardon Roundtable. You'll have Jane Duker or the unfortunately named Steve Butts come on the Reardon Roundtable and give a Democratic perspective. Jeff Rainford, longtime aide to Mayor Slay and former KMOV news reporter, who's also a Democrat, will come on Mark Reardon's show. So yeah, it's, I think there's Democrats who understand the value of the audience and want to be on those shows.
But then you've got like the solo guy on CNN, Scott Jennings, who is the only conservative on that whole channel.
Yeah, you're right about that, Brad.
And by the way, do you know he's good friends with Mark Reardon? Do you know that whole crazy story?
Yeah, isn't Jennings has some kind of a tie to St. Louis, right?
Yeah, but he's a big Cardinals baseball fan, and I think he worked with someplace he worked with Mark Reardon and stuff like that. But if you ever hear him on 97.1, he's a really fascinating guy because he's very, very, very up on all the things, and he really doesn't give. I mean, that's the reason they have him. Matter of fact, there are people talking about the fact they're going to get rid of him. I think he recently talked about the fact that CNN just extended his contract. And if you've seen him on the talking head shows, he does a nice job. And sometimes he gets in fights with people, which is like,
yeah. But I mean, he's useful to CNN because they can say they have a conservative on,
right?
So it's not like they're doing him charity work. It's not like he owes them a favor. Like, they like having him on because then they can have cover and say they have a conservative.
Right. I'm reading something here. Why are we wanting the federal government to come rescue us anyway? I think that's the answer to that. Is we're going back to the previous section. Our previous segment is that they've got money and they'll write a check, stuff like that. Okay. As far as other things are concerned, the one of the interesting things for me is that now they're saying this tornado was at its peak a mile wide. Does that remind you of anything?
Well, I did see that headline in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. What does it remind you of, Brad?
Joplin. If you've heard the stories of Joplin.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The tornado went through. Typically, your tornadoes, if you see them, they have that funnel, and obviously because they take the shape of the funnel, the top is very wide. The bottom can actually be very, very small. Sometimes as small as, a couple feet in diameter, sometimes maybe 20, 30, 40 feet in diameter. And that's why you can have a subdivision where you can have, a house that's totally destroyed and the two houses next to it don't have hardly any damage. They've got maybe some wind damage and some shingles that have penetrated the siding and stuff like that, but for the most part. This sucker was a mile wide and it was moving at 50 miles an hour. Now, I heard Dave Murray on 97.1 yesterday afternoon, and I have a lot of respect for Dave Murray, but I think he was sort of making excuses for the fact that the meteorology fraternity did not do a real good job with the storm. And he says, and I do understand what he's saying, that most of the time these storms, and we all talk about coming up I-44. We've all seen the storms literally coming up Interstate 44 into the St. Louis area. This storm was what do they call it? A whatever. I can't remember. You'd think
supercell, something like that.
Supercell. You'd think that I never went to Mississippi State and worked on my meteorology degree, which I did, but I never graduated. But he said it just came out of nowhere. Now, is that CYA or is that the truth? What do you think, John?
I don't know enough about meteorology to know that, but I think that anybody who didn't hear on Thursday that we were going to have really significant weather on Friday, I mean, I guess there's just a percentage of people that don't pay attention to weather forecasts. They're probably the kind of people going back to B Block that would call the Coast Guard and say they need to rescue people on Gilligan's Island.
Right.
If you didn't know that a storm was coming, you probably don't know a lot of things.
Or in the city, the person with responsibility for pushing the tornado warning button was at a conference on Friday because
they were probably at a conference center and they were probably eating they might have had a deal with St. Louis Public Schools where they could get some Pappy's barbecue or maybe go to Top Golf during the day.
We still didn't talk about the population decline, which was big news over the weekend. And I found that story absolutely positively fascinating that St. Louis, a lot of people, they don't realize this. The census comes out with an official census every 10 years, which is part of our constitutional duties that are set forth by our founding fathers. And it's obviously in the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, that kind of thing. Okay. But they do update it from time to time. And they do what they call mid-decade updates, which is essentially what they were doing. And it came out, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, it came out that St. Louis was the number one city in the country for percentage of population loss. Wasn't that the headline?
Yeah, I think so.
And the interesting thing was it beat San Francisco. And you think to yourself, okay, what does that say? Because we know a lot of people are hightailing out at San Francisco because living in the actual city has become sort of untenable, because of all the crime and stuff like that. See, here's the problem I have. The people in Jefferson County, Franklin County, and St. Charles County should be standing on top of their desk saying, hey, news media, come talk to us. We'll tell you why people are leaving St. Louis City and now St. Louis County and moving to the collar counties, vis-a-vis St. Charles, Jefferson, Franklin, and even in Illinois, Monroe, St. Clair, Madison. Look at why they're moving and look at why it's the great place to be, not in the city. Why would they do that, John?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think that story has been told quite a bit, right? Don't you think that I think everybody in St. Louis is familiar with the fact. And to quote a Mike Elam post, Brad, on LinkedIn within the last 24 hours, you can't build a community without safety first. No greater expert than Mike Elam has said that, Brad.
You know what? We talk about this all the time. I mean, Steve Ellman says,
what are the two things, Brad, if you were to ask Steve Ellman, what are the two things that people are concerned about when they pick a home?
Pickleball and enough car washes.
That's exactly right, Brad. And we also didn't talk about the fact that KSDK has announced where they're moving. They're moving out of downtown to an area near Forest Park.
Really? Yeah,
they just announced that. That was in the Post-Dispatch. That's not on my website today because it's not about state or federal politics. But KSDK says it's moving. They're going to move just east of Fopo Coco. So just south of Highway 40 near Forest Park Community College.
Really?
Yeah, so technically they'll still be in St. Louis City. And then earlier this post-to-speech, which is by Steph Kukuljan, and she says that the spokeswoman for KSDK says, they said safe and secure parking was a leading reason of why they are fleeing St. Louis City, according to KSDK president and general manager Alicia Elsner.
I wonder why that would be. I wonder why you would want safe and secure parking for your employees, John. Can you think of why?
I don't know. Again, they're acting directly in the face of the International Association of Carjackers. So maybe the carjackers can just move closer to Forest Park Community College, then hop on 40 and drive back to East St. Louis.
When you worked at Monsanto back in the day, did you ever worry about coming out to your car and seeing a brick thrown through your driver's side window or everything like that? You ever worry about that?
It just depended on how good I was at defending GMOs that day.
You'd have the protesters show up and harass you, right?
We had protesters outside the gates quite a bit, Brad.
Isn't there a movie about that? Protesters at the gate? Isn't that what?
I think there is, Brad.
Say goodbye,
Brad,
John.
I think you've reached the end of life today, Brad.
ELS. End of
ELS.
End of life show. Okay. Say goodbye, John.
See you tomorrow.